Students, welcome to Unit 3, Lesson 3. And before we get started with today's lesson, I wanted to remind you of a couple of things. First, tomorrow in class, we're going to be using the Edmodo app. So if you're going to bring your personal technology in, go ahead and download the app to either your cell phone or your tablet. That way you'll be ready to go as soon as you come into the classroom on Tuesday. Also, if you want to earn 2 extra dojo points, at the end of this video, I want you to go back to the Edmodo post where I posted the video, and if you just comment in the comment section one thing that you learned from the video, I'll give you 2 dojo points. Alright, and you have to have that done before you come to class on Tuesday. Alright, let's go ahead and get into our lesson. Don't forget to follow along on your guided notes and take notes as we go along. Alright, the first thing I want to point out as we're talking about expressions
is that when we're writing multiplication expressions, there are multiple ways to show multiplication using variables. And variables, that should be a vocabulary word that you learned in elementary school, but just to remind you, a variable is just a letter that is used to represent a number. And one thing to know about variables is that they can constantly change. So if we're using A to represent the number 6, in another problem, the letter A may represent 3. It just depends on the problem. So think when you see variable, think change. They can change depending on the problem. Alright, let's look at our different ways to represent multiplication when we're writing expressions. The first way is the normal way, the way that you learned in elementary school, and that's using the X. So here you'll see our normal way, A times B. So we use the X to represent multiplication. Well, as we move on into algebra, which is what we're doing here, we don't want to use this X because we're using letters to represent numbers. And this X, you can mistake that for being a variable. So we want to get rid and stop using the X. Alright, so let's look at the first way that we can represent multiplication, and that is with the dot. And we've used this before in class, so that you should be familiar with. We can go A times B. And using that dot to represent multiplication, that way you don't mistake the X to be a variable. Alright? Another way we represent multiplication is using parentheses. So anytime you see parentheses without any operation, that means it's multiplication. So here we have A times B. Notice there's no operation symbol, so we say that that is multiplication. It means the exact same thing. Alright? Another way to represent multiplication using variables is using no symbol at all. We just put the letter right next to each other. A, B. So we just put A, B, and that represents A multiplied times B. Alright? Let's look when we have a number and a variable. Again, we can use the dot, 6 times C. We can use parentheses, 6 times C. Or we can just drop all the symbols and just go 6C. Alright? And all those represent multiplication. And the last one we want to look at is when we have 2 numbers. Again, we can use our dot for 3 times 5 and go 3 times 5. We can also use parentheses, 3 times 5. However, when we're dealing with 2 numbers, we cannot use the no symbol way to represent multiplication. And when you think about it, it just makes sense. If we were to put 3 and 5 next to each other, that would look like 35. So we do not want to do that. So when we have 2 numbers, we can only use either the X, the dot, or the parentheses. And from this point forward in the year, Ms. Juhan and I want you to start using either the dot or the parentheses to represent multiplication. We want to get away from using the X because we're going to be using X's to represent variables. Alright? The next part of the video, I want you to understand some new vocabulary words we're going to be using while we're talking about expression. The first word I want you to know is the word term. A term is the part of the expression that can either be added or subtracted. So anytime we see these addition symbols, or they could be subtraction symbols, anything that falls in between the addition or subtraction symbols, we call those terms. So in this problem, 7G would be a term. 8H would be a term. And the number 3 by itself would be a term. So while you're filling out your notes, just know that terms are parts of the expression that can be either added or subtracted. Don't forget to fill in those blanks. Alright, the next word we're looking at is coefficient. The coefficient is the constant factor in a variable term. So these are the numbers right next to the variable. So here in our first term, 7G, which is our first term, 7 would be my coefficient. 8 would also be a coefficient. Now the number 3 would not be a coefficient because it doesn't have a variable, so it is just a number by itself. It's just a term. So those words you want to be familiar with: term and coefficient. Alright, next let's try to practice this a little bit, because remember, when you come into class tomorrow, we're going to get right into our practice, so you really want to pay attention because this is exactly what we're going to be doing in class tomorrow, at least part of the time. Alright, so the directions tell us to use as little symbols as possible. So we want to get rid of as many symbols as we can. So here we have 6 times b. Remember, we can just put the number right next to the variable, and it'll also represent multiplication. So that'll also be, we'll just say 6b, which means 6 times b. Alright, and our second expression, we have 4 times 3 times h. And what would it equal? Well, in this case, we can multiply 4 times 3, and that'll get us 12. And then we can just put the h, since we don't know what h represents yet, right next to our 12. So it becomes 12h, or 12 times h. Alright, same thing here. 2 times 2 times 2 times a times b. We can multiply 2 times 2, we'll get 4. Times another 2, we would get 8. So we put 8 there, and we would put the a and b right next to it. So no symbols at all. And this is just an easier way to represent multiplication when we're using variables. So this also means 8 times a times b. Alright? Just an important note that you want to get down. Variables always follow the number. So you will never have b6 or h12. The number always will come first. And the letters, the variables, should be written in alphabetical order. In alphabetical order, so if you see, like in this example, we wouldn't put the b before the a. We'll put 8ab. So we put the letters in alphabetical order. So if we look at this example, we have 5 times m times 3 times p. Well, again, I can combine my 5 times 3, and that'll get me 15. And then I will put my mp in that order because m comes before p in the alphabet. So it'll be mp. So 15 times m times p. And notice we don't have to use any symbols, and it still represents the exact same expression. Notation is that coefficients, which are those numbers that come before the variable, of 1, so if the coefficient is 1, these can be dropped off. Alright, so we don't need them. So in this example, 1 times g times w, that would equal 1gw. But remember, if the coefficient is 1, we can drop off the coefficient, so it'll just be gw. Because if you think about it, if we multiply 1 times anything, we're still going to get whatever 2 terms we multiply times. So we do not need that 1. It's unnecessary, so we'll just go gw. Alright, we're going to move on to a different concept in this lesson. And I want you to study this model first. If you look at the model, we have 2 groups of 5 combined with 2 groups of 3. So we will represent that as 2 times 5, because 5 and 5, that'll get you 10. And 2 groups of 3, which is 2 times 3, which will get you 6. So if we answer these questions, how many 5s are there in the model? Well, 1, 2, we have 2 5s. How many 3s in the model? Well, 1, 2, we have 2 3s. So what does the expression mean in words? It means the sum of 2 groups of 5. And sum means add. The sum of 2 groups of 5 and 2 groups of 3. Alright, and when you think about it, we have 2 groups of 5, and we're combining that, or adding it, to 2 groups of 3. So that's how we would say it in words. What expression could we write to represent that? Well, this is pretty easy. We could do 2 times 5 plus 2 times 3. So that's one way to look at it. Let's take a look at another way. We can look at the same expression. Let's look at the model in B. So this is B on your sheet. And if we look at it, this model, it's very similar to the model from A. So we have 5 and 3, which when we combine them together, it would be 5 plus 3. So that'll get you 8. And we have another set of 5 and 3, so 5 plus 3, which will also get you 8. So if we answer the same questions, just like in example A, how many 5s are in the model? Well, there are 2 5s. How many 3s are in the model? 2 3s. So what would this expression represent in words? Well, we put it into words. This looks like I have 2 groups of the sum of 5 and 3. Alright, so I have 2 groups of the sum of 5 and 3. Because if you look at it, I have 1, 5 plus 3, another 5 plus 3. So I have two groups of 5 plus 3s. So what expression could we use to write this? We could write 5 plus 3 plus another 5 plus 3. Well, if we think about our multiplication rules or the distributive property, we can say we have 2 times 5 plus 3, right? Because that means two groups of 5 plus 3. So if we multiply 5 plus 3 times itself, that'll be 2. Alright, let's look at the last thing on our homework sheet. And that is going to be the distributive property. In your homework, the first thing it asks us to do is to draw a model. So if we think back to what we just did with example B. We have 3, and remember, if I don't have an operation symbol, that means times x plus y. So if I was to draw a model to represent that, I could have x, y, that's 1 x plus y, x, and another, and a y, so that's another set of x plus y. So I have x plus y and x plus y. That's two groups, but I need three groups, because it says 3 times. So I can go x, and I can go y. So this represents 3 times x plus y. And if I use my distributive property, I have 3 x's plus 1, 2, 3 y's. Alright? And that's just like with the distributive property. If you remember, we'll go 3 times the first term, which is 3x, plus 3 times the second term, which will be 3y. Right? So if we apply that to example 2, we can have 8 times that first term would give me 8h, plus 8 times the second term, which will give me 24. So boys and girls, I hope you got what you needed from this video. Be ready to practice when we come into the classroom tomorrow, and I'll see you when you get there. Bye.